Hey guys, tonight we step straight into a Norse winter so cold it feels like the air is quietly judging your life choices. Snow moves sideways in the wind, the sky is the color of old pewter, and the moment you push open the longhouse door, the icy gust tells you, very politely, that you probably won't survive this. You can already smell wood smoke, hear the low murmur of neighbors, and feel the weight of a season where bread isn't just food, but strategy, hope, and sometimes a negotiation tool more intense than modern group chats. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now, because nothing bonds a sleepy audience like comparing time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, boots crunching over a thin crust of frost that breaks with every step. Behind you is the world you know. In front of you is a Norse farmstead entering the dangerous heart of winter. Frozen fields begin to blur with the dusky sky, and you can almost imagine the last patch of barley harvested just weeks before. Every grain matters, and the villagers treat each sack like a fragile hostage. You slip inside the longhouse, pushing past fur cloaks hung to dry, warming your fingers near the fire. The heat doesn't so much warm you as politely introduce itself, like, "Hi, I'm heat, but I won't be doing much today." A woman, broad-shouldered, wrapped in wool, pulls open a lidded storage chest. Inside lie several cloth sacks of grain and coarse flour. This is the village's pulse for the next 4 months. You watch her run her hand over the sacks with a tenderness normally reserved for newborns or very expensive smartphones. This, you realize, is where survival starts. Quietly, cautiously, with the counting of what isn't there. You settle by the hearth and the longhouse elder gestures for you to look toward the shadows where the family's winter rations hang in small linen bundles. They're tied from the rafters, far out of reach of mice, children, and, if you're honest, your own intrusive snack thoughts. The elder explains that each bag represents roughly 1 week of bread for the household, if everything goes well. And of course, things rarely go well. Snowstorms, unexpected guests, and that one cousin who forgets how much he already ate, these all make the careful math tremble. You listen as they describe hunger nights, the specific evenings in late winter when you go to bed early, not because you're tired, but because whispering stomachs are easier to manage when everyone pretends to be asleep. A mainstream historical fact slips into the conversation. Winter bread in Norse regions relied heavily on barley because it grew reliably in cold climates, even though wheat made a tastier loaf. You nod wisely, as if you two have strong opinions on medieval grain hardiness. This earns you the approving grunt of a farmer who looks like he wrestles frost for a hobby. But then comes the quirky tidbit, your first taste of the delightful absurdity that history likes to hide. The elder tells you of the snow loaf trick, a local tradition where people would jokingly knead tiny bits of real dough into clumps of snow to prank their neighbors with ghost bread. It wasn't edible, obviously, but during long dark months, any joke that didn't involve frostbite apparently was a hit. You imagine handing someone a frozen puff of sadness and calling it cuisine, comedy gold. As you shift closer to the fire, your eyes catch the slow rotation of the hand corn, a heavy stone mill sitting right on the ground. Someone is grinding barley into flour, and you feel the deep rumbling scrape resonate through the floor. You join them, turning the upper stone with both hands. The motion is repetitive, calming, and faintly insulting to your modern gym-free arms. Grain becomes coarse flour in the dim light, dust rising in soft clouds that coat your sleeves. It smells earthy and warm, like something that wants to be bread when it grows up. Historians still argue whether Norse families spent more total hours grinding grain in winter than in summer, because while winter had more indoor time, people were also often too exhausted or too cold to do continuous labor. You try turning the quern for a full minute and decide that scholars can go ahead and debate forever. You have no opinion other than "my shoulders hurt." At the far end of the longhouse, someone slices a rationed crust from yesterday's loaf. The knife moves with exaggerated precision, like a surgeon performing the world's most carbohydrate-themed operation. You're handed your own sliver, barely thicker than a modern phone case, but warm and surprisingly fragrant. You chew slowly, mindful that this piece should ideally last the next several hours. Everyone pretends not to watch you, but they definitely are watching to see whether you inhale your ration like an impatient raccoon. Night deepens. The fire pops. Another villager begins tallying grain usage on a piece of smoothed wood with charcoal marks. Each line represents survival measured in spoonfuls. Someone mutters that the snow outside will pile higher by morning, burying the paths and making travel impossible. You feel the longhouse huddled together, emotionally if not physically, forming a silent agreement that winter is now officially in charge. The elder begins to tell you how, during especially harsh seasons, families would pre-count hunger nights in advance, scheduling lighter rations like someone setting reminders in a calendar app, except the notifications were growling stomachs instead of phone buzzes. It's dark humor, but they share it with a casual shrug, as if to say, "Hey, it's winter. We cope how we can." You nibble the last corner of your crust, letting the smoky tang linger. The smoke comes from the hearth, where damp driftwood sometimes burn with a faintly salty scent. You want to ask whether they ever get tired of the same flavor, but then you remember you're basically eating the edible equivalent of a filing cabinet, so the question feels rude. Time blurs. The grinding stone keeps turning, your arms joining the rhythm again. The fire flickers against the carved wooden beams overhead. Shadows stretch across the floor like lazy cats. You catch snippets of conversation around you. Discussions of how long the remaining sacks might last, subtle jokes about whose turn it is to gather frozen firewood, and muttered worries about a neighbor's goat that hasn't returned for 2 days. The mood is both tense and tender, the strange combination you get when survival depends on shared chores and shared bread. At one point, a boy shuffles over and asks you if you've ever seen the winter face. I assumed this was some kind of local monster story, but no, apparently it's just the expression adults make when they realize someone ate more than their allotted share. He demonstrates it, widening his eyes dramatically and tightening his lips until he looks like a judgmental fish. You try not to laugh, but a small snort escapes, causing the room to glance over. You pretend it was a cough. Totally convincing. As the evening settles, the elder invites you to help measure tomorrow morning's bread portion. You scoop flour into a shallow wooden bowl, tapping the rim lightly to even it. The elder inspects your work, nodding approvingly, before adjusting it by a minute amount because precision is the unofficial winter religion here. It's astonishing how the difference between just enough and slightly too much can determine whether the last week of winter feels manageable or brutal. The atmosphere shifts as they recount how some winters were so severe that even a small miscalculation could send ripple effects through the community. This leads to another fringe tidbit. In a certain village to the north, families supposedly used carved wooden ration spoons designed so that a week's worth of grain would always fit into exactly 14 scoops. The spoons had decorative animal heads at the handle: wolves, elk, bears, because if you're going to live on rationing, you might as well be stylish about it. You sit back and breathe in the mingled scents of charred wood, barley dust, and wool cloaks warmed by proximity to the fire. Outside, the wind claws at the longhouse walls like a bored cat. Inside, everything is slow and careful. The rhythm of the grinding, the low conversation, the soft chewing, it all merges into something steady, almost meditative. You catch yourself matching your breathing to the scrape of the quern. And through it all, every villager treats bread not as something to be eaten lightly, but as a quiet companion during sleepless nights. You realize winter has a way of turning food into emotion, into memory, into a small, warm promise that tomorrow will arrive, even if the snow tries its hardest to cancel it. Your eyelids drop a little. Someone hands you another tiny portion, not for eating, they clarify, but for practice kneading. You press your fingers into the pliant dough, feeling its cool resistance. A joke drifts across the room about how newcomers always knead too enthusiastically, like they're trying to beat the flour into revealing state secrets. You smirk and slow your movements, coaxing the dough instead of wrestling it. Eventually, the fire dwindles to a deep orange glow. People lie down on straw-filled bedding spread around the room, each wrapped in blankets that smell faintly of sheep and smoke. You pull a fur over your shoulders, listening to the quiet churn of the storm outside. The quern grinding stops. Someone coughs. Another shifts, settling in. For a moment, you could swear the longhouse breathes like one giant creature.
You wake before the longhouse does, roused by the faint glow of embers that look like sleepy eyes peering out from the hearth. Your breath curls in the air as a pale ribbon, soft and harmless, but still a reminder that the cold outside is the kind of cold that drafts entire novels about your regret. You sit up, stretch stiff limbs, and follow the quiet shuffle of early risers toward the ration chest. The day begins not with sunlight, because sunlight is apparently on vacation, but with the sound of barley being measured. Barley rules now. You can feel it the moment someone unties the first sack, that heavy, grainy scent drifting into the air like a slow exhale. Wheat is a luxury here, more rumor than regular ingredient, but barley? Barley is the reigning monarch of winter bread, the dependable cousin who shows up to every gathering, whether invited or not. The grains spill into a bowl with a dry hiss, the sound of tomorrow's loaf being born one handful at a time. A farmer hands you a few barley kernels to chew while you watch the morning preparation. They're tough, faintly nutty, and about as exciting as snacking on gravel with ambitions. But you nod appreciatively, because you're trying to blend in and because chewing loudly in a room full of rationing experts feels like a crime. The longhouse slowly wakes, one blanket ghost at a time. Someone rekindles the fire with the gentleness of a parent waking a toddler from a nap. You join the group gathering around the large wooden trough where flour is mixed with water, salt, and whatever warmth the day can muster. Steam rises faintly from the bucket of warmish water, and you're told this is the good batch, the water heated specifically for bread making, instead of the regular, just don't freeze to death water supply. You kneel beside them and watch as the flour mixture thickens into a dough that looks both humble and heroic. One of the villagers, a woman with arms that could knead the concept of resistance itself, folds the dough with practiced movements. She tells you that barley dough behaves differently from wheat dough, less stretchy, more crumbly, always requiring affection mixed with stubbornness. Like a goat, she adds, but tastier. You laugh politely, unsure if that qualifies as a joke or a warning. As you observe, the mainstream historical fact arrives naturally. Barley was the backbone of Norse bread making because it grew quickly and tolerated colder climates far better than wheat or rye. You try to imagine a world where your survival depends on the mood of a plant, and suddenly your houseplant killing tendencies feel like a life-threatening flaw. But winter has its own logic, and barley reigns because barley survives. Breakfast is a thin slice of yesterday's loaf topped with a pat of butter so small it could legally be considered a suggestion. You chew it slowly, savoring every smoky, warm bite. The bread has that familiar dense texture, like someone compressed the concept of nutrition into an edible paperweight. And yet, when you finish, you find yourself wanting more. Not because it's delicious exactly, but because it tastes like fuel, like continuation. By midday, cooks are already preparing strategies for stretching today's flour thin. This is where things get interesting. Stretching flour thin. The Longhouse matriarch pulls out a small stash of extenders, ingredients that bulk up the dough when grain supplies run low. Bark from certain trees, dried moss, crushed fish bones, ground peas, even the powder of dried wildflowers. She shows you each ingredient proudly, as if giving a tour of a chef's pantry, except the chef here is trying to outsmart starvation while maintaining a shred of dignity. You pinch a bit of one mixture between your fingers, dried lichen powder, and your initial thought is, ah, yes, seasoning for a moss-based diet. Excellent. But the villagers insist it's nutritious. They mix a small scoop into the dough, and you see how the flour stretches further without noticeably changing texture, though the aroma does take on a faint woodland personality. A joking teenager leans over and whispers, "If you can taste the moss, you added too much." You file that away as survival advice you hope never to use in real life. Someone brings up a fringe tidbit, an old tale about a northern community that supposedly baked air loaves, dough so heavily mixed with snow and birch ash that it puffed strangely when baked. They claim sailors loved it for long voyages, lightweight, packable, basically the medieval version of disappointing protein bars. You're skeptical, but the villagers insist the story swirls around enough campfires to count. While the dough rises slowly near the fire, you watch the longhouse shift into communal baking mode. This is when you stumble upon the subtle politics of shared winter loaves. Secret communal loaves. The warmest part of the longhouse becomes a baking corner, a makeshift winter bakery run by soft-spoken authorities who wield wooden paddles like diplomatic tools. Everyone contributes something to the communal loaves, a scoop of flour, a pinch of salt, a spoon of sourdough starter passed down generations. The starter lives in a rounded clay pot that smells sharp and ancient, like it remembers winters everyone else has forgotten. As the communal dough forms, a small debate arises over who gets which slice later today. Not arguments, exactly, more like gentle territorial negotiations disguised as casual conversation. "I added the last of my pea flour," someone mentions, in a voice that clearly means, "Please give me a middle slice and not another corner." "Well, I kept it alive," another counters, diplomacy thick in their tone. A third person chimes in with, "And I chopped the firewood so this could bake properly." All very civil, all mildly pointed. You recognize this immediately as the ancient ancestor of the office coworker who says, "Oh sure, I just handled all the reports while you were out." As you observe, a soft discussion arises about a tradition called bread shift, the bread shift, where families swapped portions of their loaves during lean winters as a ritual of goodwill. It ensured that no household bore heavy scarcity alone. Sometimes these swaps were symbolic, sometimes strategic, sometimes a subtle way of checking whether a neighbor's stores were dangerously low. Historians still argue whether bread shift was a widespread practice or just regionally specific. But today, the villagers talk about it like it's a trusted old friend. You watch pieces being exchanged with a frequency that feels both generous and slightly competitive. "Take this piece," someone tells you, pressing a warm hunk into your hand. "It's from yesterday's batch, our best one this week." You suspect you've been gifted the slice that was least critically needed, but it still tastes deeply comforting. While the communal loaves bake on heated stones beside the fire, you inhale the aroma that fills the room. It's nutty, earthy, and edged with a faint smokiness that clings to your clothes and hair. The longhouse brightens. Not from sunlight, because sunlight would require the sun to participate, but from mood. People chat more, move more, laugh more softly. Bread does that. Even rationed bread, even moss-enriched barley-heavy doom-season bread. When the loaves finally emerge, they're placed on a table carved with runic patterns. Knives slide through them carefully, each slice portioned with fairness bordering on mathematics. You receive your allotted piece and cradle it like it's a small, edible pet. As the day winds toward evening, you sit with the villagers around the fire, chewing slowly, rationing the moment. The longhouse hums with quiet gratitude for the grain, for the warmth, for each other, for another day navigated. And as you savor the last bite of your slice, you understand the unspoken truth the villagers have lived by for generations. Bread isn't just survival. Bread is community, measured in crumbs.
Morning breaks, or rather, it suggests the idea of breaking. The sky outside the longhouse is a dim, bluish-gray smear, like someone tried to paint daylight from memory and ran out of enthusiasm halfway through. You rub sleep from your eyes, feeling that familiar draft weaving through the rafters, the kind that whispers, "Bundle up, traveler." Seriously, more layers. Today, you're heading out on a short but necessary winter trek, and the villagers insist you cannot go without proper provisions. That means one thing: travel rations. You sit near the hearth while a stoic-looking farmer wraps dense, rectangular blocks of journey bread in layers of cloth. You recognize the loaf from yesterday. Hard as ambition, heavier than it looks, and honestly, a little intimidating. This is ferdabröd, travel bread, designed not for pleasure, but endurance. You lift one block and nod thoughtfully, pretending it doesn't immediately drag your arm down like a brick of carbs and self-doubt. The farmer explains, in a tone that implies this is obvious, that journey bread is baked until nearly dry so it won't mold for weeks. You think of modern energy bars and immediately feel guilty because those never required someone to burn dry wood for 6 hours straight. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Norse travelers often carried hard, dry bread on voyages or hunting trips, paired with dried fish or cheese to soften it in the mouth. You imagine gnawing your way through one of these on a windy cliffside and suddenly appreciate your own era's questionable gas station snacks. Before you depart, the longhouse elder hands you a small pouch of smoked fish, dried apples, and something that looks suspiciously like a cube of fat. They assure you it's nutritious, which is historically accurate, but not emotionally comforting. Still, you thank them and tuck it away. As you prepare to step outside, a teenager slaps your shoulder and says, if you get lost, follow your hunger home. You assume this is advice, but the grin suggests it's partly a joke about how loudly your stomach growled last night. You smile, shove an extra scarf around your neck, and push open the heavy wooden door. Cold punches your cheeks immediately. The wind knifes sideways, sweeping across the open fields and mounding snow along fences and houses. You squint as flakes sting your eyelashes. 2 villagers accompany you for the first leg of your journey, stomping through the drifts with practiced ease while you perform an unintentional interpretive dance titled Trying Not to Slip. You trudge along, clutching your journey bread like a talisman. The village slowly disappears behind you, swallowed by the white landscape. Your boots crunch, your breath swirls. Somewhere, a raven caws like it's mocking your commitment to this trek. After a while, the group pauses beneath a cluster of leafless birch trees to rest. One of your companions breaks a chunk off their own travel loaf and motions for you to do the same. You try. The bread resists. You try harder. It continues to resist. Finally, you bite directly into it and nearly regret it. It's not bad, just aggressively practical, dense, slightly smoky, with a sour undertone from the fermentation that makes you think the bread has a personality, and that personality is, I dare you. One of the villagers chuckles and shows you the trick. Dip the piece briefly into snow to soften the outer layer. It works surprisingly, turning the brick-like texture into something closer to edible gravel. You chew, savoring the subtle flavors and the way it warms your core. You also wonder whether modern cooking shows would survive a Norse season. Answer, no.
Absolutely not. After a few minutes, your companions leave you with a nod and a "May the wind remember you kindly," which sounds poetic, but also like a threat. Alone now, you continue onward through the forest edge, remembering the elder's advice: walk steadily, conserve your breath, and treat your provisions like sacred artifacts. Eventually, you reach a small outpost, just a hunting shed tucked against a rocky hill. You duck inside, grateful for the faint smell of old smoke lingering in the air. Here, your journey bread becomes more than food. It's part of the survival ecosystem. Salt, smoke, survival. You unwrap your pouch and take inventory. Dried fish, thin, curled, salty like ocean ghosts. A few pieces of smoked reindeer meat, dark and aromatic. A chunk of aged cheese that's definitely seen things. These pairings aren't meant to delight your taste buds. They're meant to keep you upright in freezing winds. You nibble a piece of dried fish with your bread. The texture is chewy, the flavor bold, salty enough to blink you twice, smoky enough to remind you of the longhouse hearth. And yet there's a comfort in this combination. The bread's dense blandness balances the sharpness of the fish, and for a moment you feel fortified, like you've unlocked ancient winter DLC. A quirky tidbit crosses your mind, the one the villagers mentioned jokingly last night. Some Norse hunters supposedly believed eating extremely salty food before traveling would warm the blood faster. There's no way that's physiologically accurate, but the idea is charming in the same way peppermint tea convinces modern people they're doing holistic wellness. You sip melted snow from a cup and pretend the fish warmed your soul. As you eat, you begin to appreciate how deeply smoke infuses survival here. Meat is smoked, cheese is smoked, even some winter breads are smoked because hearths are rarely unlit. Everything tastes faintly like a campfire with opinions. Historians still argue whether the intense smokiness found in certain archaeological bread samples resulted from deliberate technique or unavoidable longhouse ventilation issues. But either way, the flavor became part of winter identity. You chew thoughtfully, imagining future scholars debating your lunch and overanalyzing the crumb patterns. When you finish eating, you walk back outside, and the temperature feels even colder than before. You need warmth, and the outpost has just the thing: a cooking pit buried in the snow. Fire pit tricks. You clear snow from a shallow depression, revealing a circle of blackened stones. Last night's hunters left embers beneath the ash, still faintly warm. You kneel, brush aside the top layer, and feed the pit thin slivers of bark. The embers glow, slow but eager. Soon small flames flicker between the stones. Now it's time for a trick every villager insists on teaching you: reheating bread using hot rocks. They swear this is the only way journey bread transforms from weapon grade to pleasantly edible. You place a stone in the fire until it's hot, not red hot, just convincingly warm. Then set your bread on it while shielding it from the wind. Steam rises faintly from the loaf, carrying a scent that's richer than before, almost sweet. You test it with your fingers. Softer, warmer, alive again. As you eat the reheated slice, you realize how much of Norse winter cooking relies on improvisation. Buried ember pits, stone heating, snow softening, smoke drying. It's all a dance with elemental forces, negotiated daily. Your mind wanders to the fringe story the elder shared, about travelers who would bury dough in warm ashes overnight during emergencies. Supposedly, you could return in the morning to find a lumpy, smoky, perfectly edible bread ball waiting for you. The villagers debated whether this was actually common practice, and historians still argue whether ash baking was reserved for desperate moments or just a convenient shortcut. Either way, the thought of waking up to an ash-baked breakfast feels oddly delightful. You finish your meal slowly, savoring each bite like it's a tiny victory. The forest hums softly around you, wind in the branches, the distant call of ravens, the slow creak of ice shifting along the hillside. The world feels still, suspended between breaths. You sip more melted snow, letting its cold purity wash the smoky aftertaste away. Your fingers warm near the flames, your stomach settles, and you realize the journey bread has done exactly what it needed to do, keep you going without complaint. It's not glamorous, but it's dependable, the kind of food that won't abandon you when the weather gets dramatic. Eventually, you pack up the remains of your provisions, tamp down the embers, and leave the pit as tidy as you found it. The trek back will be just as cold, just as long, just as filled with crunchy snow and wind-snarled hair. But now you have the steady warmth of nourishment in you, the quiet power of smoked fish and dense barley working together like a survival tag team. As you begin the return journey, you take one last look at the outpost. It sits quiet, stoic, and faintly smoking, as if it's also chewing over your visit. Then you turn toward the village, step into your own footprints, and walk steadily home, led not by the sun, which still refuses to show up, but by the small warmth blooming in your chest. And as you go, you carry a truth that every Norse traveler once knew. Winter doesn't reward strength, it rewards preparation.
You keep walking along the sandstone corridor, the heat-dampened silence curling around you like a soft blanket. By now, the desert sun feels less like an enemy and more like a distant, predictable bell that the builders had learned to tame long before you ever arrived. Their shadecraft wasn't just technique, it was temperament, patience carved directly into stone. You glide past another half-finished archway, running your fingertips along the shallow chisel marks. Each line feels almost rhythmic, as if the workers timed their movements to the slow pulse of the shifting dunes. You picture a team of them pausing every few minutes, not because they were tired, but because they respected the air itself, waiting for the brief exhale of cooler wind that rolled across the plateau at certain predictable intervals. They didn't fight nature, they negotiated with it. And here, as you step into a wider chamber, that philosophy becomes obvious. The room is shaped like a bowl, but tilted deliberately so that the lower half always stays in partial shade. It's the kind of place that almost tricks your brain into believing the temperature has dropped by 20 degrees, even though nothing physically changed. You exhale, and even the dust motes seem to move more slowly, drifting like lazy fireflies. A row of stone jars lines the far wall, enormous things, each one with a narrow throat and swollen belly. You remember earlier examples the builders used, jars half buried to keep water cool, but these are positioned differently, angled toward the chamber's mouth. You realize they weren't for storage at all. They were for airflow. The desert wind entering the chamber had to weave between them, and in doing so, softened itself, like cloth pulled through a ring. Warm gusts entered as sighs. You linger there, fascinated by how something so simple, jars placed at a specific angle, could create such a profound shift in the room's mood. The builders probably sat here at midday, their tools resting beside them, waiting for shadows to stretch just a little longer before they resumed work. You can almost hear the quiet murmurs, the gentle laughter, the shared understanding that the desert was not to be conquered, but befriended. You continue onward, drifting into a narrower corridor. Here the ceiling dips lower, forcing your posture to soften, slowing you further. The sandstone glows with the faintest amber hue, as if storing centuries of sunsets. You move past a long bench carved directly into the wall, smooth, sloped, perfectly shaded at all times. A place to rest, or to cool a jar of water, or simply to wait for the right moment. These people were masters of waiting. Somewhere ahead, a faint trickle echoes, almost impossibly soft, almost imagined. Yet the sound draws you in like a whisper. And as you follow it, you begin to sense what the builders understood better than anyone, that the desert doesn't reward force, only attentiveness. Every step you take feels like an invitation to slow down even more, to fall into rhythm with the stone itself. And so you keep walking, guided by shade, sound, and silence, deeper into the ancient craft of those who shaped coolness out of heat and calm out of chaos.